Greetings and welcome to Short and Nerdy Nonfiction with Connlyn Sinclair. Today's amazing topic is, can you Watchmen die as pulp heroes? Love it or hate it, The Watchmen is probably the most influential comic in the history of everything comics. Even somebody like me who is not an avid comic book reader certainly knows of The Watchmen. I know, I've read it, I've seen the movie several times, I own the movie, and while Zack Snyder is certainly a hack, it is an interesting movie. As I understand Moore's premise, he thought that superheroes were basically just vigilantes as we would understand vigilantes in the real world. They weren't, they're not doing this for lofty ideals of justice. They're fascists, they're tech bros, they're sociopaths, thrill seekers. They love violence. Violence is their job, quite literally, as superheroes. And it's not a pleasant, depiction of heroics or the pulp superhero universe. Watchmen's main cast are all parodies of Charlton Comics comic book characters. Obviously, most of the parodies are so ridiculous that you can't really see it anymore. Rorschach is probably the only one who still resembles what he's meant to be poking fun at, the whole libertarian ethos of the question and that ridiculous idea of libertarian, Randian, moral nonsense. And certainly there are things you can poke fun of with many of the classic pulp heroes. Tarzan, John Carter, Burroughs' heroes are, they can be kind of ridiculous if you wanted to poke fun at them. Even the book versions, the movie Tarzan is ridiculous. Book Tarzan could also be taken to kind of an extreme. He is kind of an uber-mock character. I mean, he is supposed to be the greatest athlete on Earth, having lived in the jungle, and yet obviously the black people in Tarzan aren't to Tarzan's amazing jungle power strength. And you could kind of make fun of the racism there. I think some of the John Carter stories, they're not as racist. Burroughs' concepts of race certainly became more progressive in John Carter, but you could make fun of a lot of the John Carter series. Carter is kind of, he's a romantic hero, he's a swashbuckling swordsman. You could take that and run with it. You could make him what he probably would have been, a thrill-seeking Virginia gunfighter. Somebody who didn't really care about slavery, but didn't really care enough about anything to fight against it. You certainly could make an edgy John Carter in the style of Watchmen. Other pulp heroes, there certainly have been later attempts at doing weird, edgy things with them. The Dynamite Shadow Run kept a lot of the supernatural elements that were not present in the Shadow novels, but were present in the radio show with Orson Welles, and they really ran with that to make, psychic battles with evil psychics. I mean, it's all kind of nonsense. They had that whole thing where they crossed the Shadow over with the Twilight Zone. Never read that comic, but that certainly is weird. But that's, the other direction. That's taking pulp and making it pulpy. And certainly, I prefer taking pulp and making it pulpy. Crossing the Shadow over with the Twilight Zone is a crazy idea, but it works. because the Shadow is a nutty character when you're using the radio version who's psychic and clouds men's minds. But could you do the opposite? Could you do a realistic, no powers, gritty Shadow? Could you do that with Doc Savage or the Shadow? I'm slightly more familiar with the Shadow, although I've read more Doc Savage, but Doc Savage is a little more dense than some of the Shadow mythology, at least to me. I'm sure you could. I don't think it would be very interesting, because if you bring the Shadow down to kind of a realistic street level character, that's just, that's just a guy. He doesn't even have a costume. He doesn't even have a gimmick. He's just a guy with a gun. And I suppose that's kind of what the point of Watchmen is, but it would make the Shadow really stupid. The 40s Shadow movies, which are my personal favorite take on the character, they did a no powers version of the Shadow. The 1942 Shadow movie, I think it was 42, it might have been 38. The Shadow was just a guy who was an identity thief. He steals the identity of the lawyer and ingratiates himself into the house. He still has the gun and the cloak, but that was a very grounded version of the Shadow. It's not bad. I certainly recommend it. It's on Amazon. I certainly own it through Amazon. It's very good. And then the 40s version, which was, I think, Return of the Shadow. Again, no powers. He was a stage magician. He's just kind of an eccentric stage magician in that. But that's not gritty. That's not Watchmen dies, because Alan Moore, writing the Shadow as a Watchmen character, would probably have him be a schizophrenic with a gun, and that's not very interesting. That's just kind of lame. And I guess the thing that keeps, Rorschach and Night Owl and Silk Spectre from being just kind of lame is that they're really well developed in the backstories, I guess. And I suppose if Alan Moore had included a Shadow character, if, say, DC had bought Dynamite didn't exist then, but that copyright group, and instead of Charlton, he still might have made something similar to Watchmen with the Street and Smith characters. That would have been interesting. I don't think it would have been as good or as memorable as Watchmen. Supposedly, Doc Shadow, I'm mixing them up now. Doc Savage was based on a real person. I think the story goes that Hackenschmidt, who was a bodybuilder / linguist / wrestler, was the inspiration for Doc Shadow. Hackenschmidt was a Russian wrestler, bodybuilder, came to the West after the Russian Revolution. Supposedly spoke many languages, was a personal trainer. He was the inspiration for Doc Savage. And of course, Doc Savage goes way beyond that. Doc Savage is the complete, ultimate human being. Obviously, Doc Savage and Lester Dent, the author, weren't Nazis. Excuse me. But there's kind of a Nazi element to it, the idea of the ultimate man who is better than everyone else. And Doc Savage certainly was better than everyone else. His assistants, who were supposedly the greatest scientific minds on Earth, were always playing catch-up to Doc Savage. And I suppose if you tried to Watchmen dies that, Doc Savage wouldn't be very different than Ozymandias in The Watchmen. And he'd still lose most of his charm, because the charm of Doc Savage is kind of the absurdity. Obviously, that wasn't the charm of Doc Savage back in the day. I think people took Doc Savage at face value at one point, but I've read 5 Doc Savage novellas now, and I think the entire appeal of Doc Savage is absurd. It's ridiculous. You can't realistically portray Doc Savage. You could probably more easily realistically portray Superman in a no-powers human being alternate universe than you could Doc Savage. So, no, I don't think you could Watchmenize Doc Savage and the Shadow. Obviously, Alan Moore wrote League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is like Watchmen, an anti-superhero comic. I have read the first 2 volumes of League and the first issue of the 3rd volume. The 3rd volume he did without DC's supervision as his own publisher, and it was bad. It was bad. The entire 3rd volume was just bad. And no, I'm not saying it's bad because they made Quartermain a bisexual, polyamorous person. I mean, is it ridiculous, kind of, that Quartermain and Mina Murray are in a bisexual, polyamorous relationship with a gender-swapping Greek god? Maybe not. I think a lot of queer fiction these days would consider that really an average romantasy plot. Does it come out of nowhere, being written by a 70-something Englishman who is, by all accounts, straight and cisgendered? Yeah, that is a little weird on Alan Moore's part. That is not why the 3rd volume is bad. It's just that doesn't have anyone telling him what not to do at that point, which is great if you're a big Alan Moore fan, but I shudder to think what Watchmen would have looked like if they let Alan Moore go off the handle. And even League without Alan Moore going off the handle was certainly something else. A lot of it did have that kind of edgy element. Quartermain starts out as a heroin addict. Mina is divorced. A lot of people gave Alan Moore a lot of flack for having Mina get divorced because Dracula is considered such a famous love story. I've even been told that Alan Moore has been accused of just complete disrespect when it comes to the Dracula plot line, that he originally wanted Irene Adler as the lead. I don't see his Mina as Irene Adler, but his takes on classic literature are very questionable. The whole thing with Dr. Moreau was disgusting. But that's all to say that I'm not a big League fan. The 1st volume is fun. The 2nd volume is weird. The 3rd volume is out of this world weird. But he didn't really do a Watchmen treatment on them. Sure, they're edgy, they're not heroic. The Victorian reader would probably shudder at Alan Moore's Quartermain or Hyde or Nemo. It's not really Watchmenized. They're just jerks. There's not really the stylized nature of the Watchmen universe, so maybe Moore gave up at that point. Maybe his writing isn't replicatable like that. Or maybe he realized that you can't do for Pulp what he did for superheroes. Not exactly, not to the letter. I really should have reread League before making this podcast. To really go back, but yeah, I'm going to go on record and saying I don't think League is a Watchmen version of Pulp. I think League is very much its own thing, and whether you like it or whether you don't. The concept was great. The execution, not my cup of tea. So I think Alan Moore knew you couldn't really do Watchmen to other things. And I think later Watchmen takes haven't been very good. They had the whole Watchmen TV series. I haven't heard jack shit about it. I never watched it. I had HBO at the time. I think Watchmen is not franchisable. They've tried several times to franchise Watchmen. I did read part of the sequel comic while Rorschach's doctor's son is the new Rorschach. That kind of works. But no, I think Pulp. Pulp is Pulp. Superheroes are superheroes. They're separate. You can do some things with one, some things with the other. Not everything you can do with both. I love Pulp. I'm not the greatest superhero fan. That's me. Yeah.